Vamos começar. Good afternoon, good morning to you all. Let's start another session of the doctoral student seminar coordinated by Professor Mário Santiago de Carvalho, whom I represent in this session. I'd like to welcome you all, and especially our guest for this session, Kermit Snelson from Chicago, to whom I would like to thank for the cooperation with the Institute of Philosophical Studies, and in particular for this conference on the impact of postmodern Chicago on post-medieval Coimbra. I hand you over the speaking slot, Kermit.
Thanks, Professor Martins. Thank you to the IEF, the secretary, the artistic staff, to all of you who worked very hard to make this session possible. I'm greatly honored by the invitation to this group, and I hope that you find my presentation to be of some value. Thank you very much, and I will hand it over to Robert to play the video.
A pair of cities is a device used frequently in world literature. In the final book of the Bible, St. John the Evangelist described the end of the world by pairing the cities of Babylon and the New Jerusalem. St. Augustine of Hippo drew a comparison between the city of God and the city of man. Charles Dickens captured the essence of the French Revolution by pairing London and Paris. This lecture pairs Coimbra and Chicago to explore semiotics, which is the study of signs. According to the late American semiotician John Deely, signs were first established as the subject of a unified field of inquiry by Jesuits at the University of Coimbra. Deely claimed that the commentaries on Aristotle by the Coimbra Jesuit College, to which I will refer in this lecture as the CACJC, was the source from which the Coimbra-trained Dominican theologian John of St. Thomas, whom Deely preferred to call John Ponceau, and the American logician Charles Sanders Peirce, the founder of American pragmatism, independently defined the sign as a relationship between three things. Roughly, X is interpreted by Y to mean Z. The definition of a sign that Peirce himself wrote for Baldwin's dictionary appears on this slide. Deely further claimed that this triadic relationship is the only mode of being that is indifferent to the distinction between mind-dependent and mind-independent reality. This terra incognita between being and non-being was therefore perhaps the greatest of all the discoveries made by Portugal during its celebrated age of discoveries. An even more fundamental claim made by Deely, however, was that semiosis, or the action of signs, is the influence of the future on the past. To understand Deely's thesis concerning the influence of the CACJC, we must therefore study not only the Coimbra commentaries on Aristotle and the post-medieval world that produced them, but also Deely himself and the postmodern world that produced him. From this semiotic perspective, we discover remarkable parallels between post-medieval Coimbra and postmodern Chicago. Just as the Jesuits at the University of Coimbra turned to Aristotle to create a curriculum suitable to training Portugal to administer the global empire that its priority in developing navigation technologies had won, so did a team of neo-Thomists at the University of Chicago during the decade spanning World War II also turn to Aristotle to train the United States of America to administer the global empire won by its priority in developing nuclear weapons. Many of the most important milestones in the development of nuclear weapons were achieved on the campus of the University of Chicago itself during 1942, the year in which John Deely happened to have been born nearby. A more significant coincidence, however, is that two of the most important personal influences on John Deely, namely Jacques Maritain and Mortimer Adler, happen to have been the two most important theorists of this neo-Thomist revival at the University of Chicago, and two more of Deely's most important personal influences, Benedict Ashley and Thomas Sebeok, were students at Chicago during that time. To understand how Chicago came to play this crucial role in world history, however, we must begin at the beginning. In the year 1712, the site of what was to become the city of Chicago occupied the center of France's colonial empire in North America. The reason for this was the Chicago Portage, a short land bridge that joined the Great Lakes with the Mississippi River. This was to make the future city of Chicago the nexus of the greatest maritime empire on the planet, with direct access to 6 sea regions: the Eastern Seaboard, the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, the California coast, and the Pacific Northwest. The Chicago Portage entered history through the efforts of Jacques Marquette, a Jesuit missionary and explorer who had learned about it from the indigenous people known as the Kaskaskia. In the year 1674, Marquette and his party became the first Europeans to spend a winter within what are now Chicago's city limits. In this slide, we see the monument that stands in Chicago today upon the exact spot of Marquette's camp. Marquette began his academic training in the autumn of 1657 as a student of logic and philosophy at the Jesuit University of Pont-à-Mousson. It is very likely that Marquette encountered the CACJC during his studies there, because Jacques Dinet, who was prefect of studies at La Flèche, where the future philosopher René Descartes encountered the CACJC during his studies, had also been trained at Pont-à-Mousson. Therefore, Coimbra probably had a connection with the founding of Chicago. The history of New France was marked by many wars between the French and the British, both of whom had allies among the indigenous peoples. These wars were part of a series of what are considered history's first world wars, beginning with the War of the Grand Alliance and followed by the War of the Spanish Succession. The Third World War in this series was the 7 Years' War, which was instigated in 1754 by the actions of a young officer from Virginia named George Washington. Britain defeated France in 1759 on the Plains of Abraham outside of Quebec City, and in 1764, the French-speaking population of Ikeda, a formerly Portuguese territory now known as Nova Scotia, was forcibly expelled. 30 years after these events, George Washington was serving as the founding president of the United States of America. The official motto of Quebec today is Je me souviens, or I remember, which recalls the loss of New France in a mood reminiscent of the quintessentially Portuguese saudade, which might be translated as the presence of absence. The United States of America was refounded by its 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, whose election precipitated the American Civil War. A politician from Illinois, the state in which Chicago is by far the largest city, Lincoln was nominated for the presidency in Chicago and was strongly supported by German-born radicals who had fled to Illinois following the crushed European revolutions of 1848. Their revolutionary activities were far more successful in the United States than they had been in Europe. These so-called 48ers formed the bodyguard at Lincoln's inauguration on March 4, 1861, and at his funeral in April 1865. One of these former German revolutionaries was Carl Schurz, who served as one of Lincoln's generals during the Civil War, and was eventually appointed as the United States Secretary of the Interior. German radicals were also prominent in the membership of the Wide Awakes, the paramilitary wing of Lincoln's 1860 presidential campaign. By the year 1884, Chicago was largely German-speaking, and had become perhaps the most influential center of anarchist and communist agitation in the world. On October 7th of that year, the organization that would soon be known as the American Federation of Labor demanded that 8 hours be considered a legal day's labor beginning on May 1st, 1886. Within a week after May Day of 1886 arrived, deadly political violence erupted in Chicago's Haymarket Square during a demonstration in support of a general strike. 7 anarchists, 5 of whom were German-born, were condemned to death, and 4 of them were eventually hanged by the state of Illinois. Their bodies lie today in Forest Park, a near suburb of Chicago, and over time have become surrounded by the graves of many other prominent anarchists and communists. One of these is Joseph Dietzken, a German-born revolutionary based in Chicago, who was regarded by Karl Marx as having invented dialectical materialism. Stalin later codified Dietzken's brainchild as the official philosophy of the Soviet Union. The Haymarket Martyrs were also commemorated during the founding meeting of the Second International, which was convened in Paris on July 14, 1889, the centennial of the storming of the Bastille. On July 20th, they resolved that May Day be observed as what would soon be called International Workers' Day, a practice now officially adopted by the governments of more than 160 nations, including Portugal, following its own revolution in 1974. The Haymarket affair did not escape the notice of the Monist, a journal edited by the German-born comparative theologian Paul Carus. In 1891, the Monists published a learned and respectful letter sent from the Joliet Penitentiary by Michael Schwab, one of the convicted Haymarket anarchists who escaped the noose after appealing to the governor of Illinois. The Monist, and its sister journal, The Open Court, based in Chicago, were North America's house journals of monism, a movement founded by the German biologist Ernst Haeckel. The aim of this movement was to re-establish religion upon science, thus emancipating it and society from creed, dogma, and priestcraft. According to Carus, monism is a unitary conception of the world. Matter and mind, soul and body, atoms and molecules, and even God and world do not denote separate existences, but only abstracts that represent parts or features of one inseparable and indivisible entirety. Paul Carus noticed many affinities between monism and the philosophy of Charles Sanders Peirce, whom I have already mentioned in this lecture as the founder of American pragmatism. Between 1891 and 1909, Carus published in the Monist most of the great texts of Peirce's final period, such as The Architecture of Theories, Man's Glassy Essence, The Doctrine of Necessity Examined, The Law of Mind, and Evolutionary Love. Carus also published many seminal articles by Peirce in the Open Court, such as the one published in 1893 titled The Marriage of Religion and Science, depicted on this slide. In this article, Peirce makes the striking statement that science is a living and growing thing, not a dead body of systematized knowledge. We might even say, writes Peirce, that knowledge is not necessary to science. The tradition of American pragmatism founded by Peirce found its first institutional base in Chicago. One of these institutions was Hull House, a settlement co-founded by the social worker Jane Addams in 1889. The goal of the settlement movement, which had begun in 1884 with the founding of Toynbee Hall in London, was to alleviate the conditions of urban poverty and social atomization brought about by industrialization. Addams herself was inspired by the democratic ideals of Abraham Lincoln, who had been a friend of her father. Lincoln believed, as Addams relates in her autobiography, that if the democratic experiment in self-government was to come to fruition, it must be brought about by the people themselves. The University of Chicago was founded 1 year after Hull House, and Addams came to have a great influence on its faculty members George Herbert Mead and John Dewey, who founded there both the world's first pragmatist philosophy department and the nation's first department of sociology. Under the influence of Addams, the University of Chicago established its own settlement house in Chicago in 1894. Pragmatism's interest in social theory was best stated by Peirce's friend Francis Ellingwood Abbott. The character and fate of every philosophy hinge at last on the mode of its transition of the I to the we. One might say that what missions were to the Jesuits, settlement houses were to the pragmatists. By the 1890s, Chicago had become one of the wonders of the world. In a letter dated September 28, 1896, to his brother, the novelist Henry James, the psychologist and pragmatist philosopher William James wrote, "It has been a rather cultivating summer for me, and an active one, of which the best impression was that of the greatness of Chicago. It needs a Victor Hugo to celebrate it." As for the University of Chicago, James wrote in a letter dated October 29, 1903, to Mrs. Henry Whitman, "Chicago University has, during the past 6 months, given birth to the fruit of its 10 years of gestation under John Dewey. The result is wonderful. a real school, and real thought. Important thought, too. Did you ever hear of such a city or such a university? Here at Harvard, we have thought, but no school. At Yale, a school, but no thought. Chicago has both. The essence of this new school of thought, according to William James, is that it abandons the ideal of objectivity, even in the so-called hard sciences, such as physics, chemistry, or mathematics. In an essay published in 1904, James proposed the word humanism as a better name for this new philosophy than pragmatism, because, in his words, it expresses the essence of the new way of thought, which is that it is impossible to strip the human element out from even our most abstract theorizing. All our mental categories, without exception, have been evolved because of their fruitfulness for life, and owe their being to historic circumstances, just as much as do the nouns and verbs and adjectives in which our languages clothe them. To help understand this way of thinking, let us return from Chicago to Coimbra. The flag of the Republic of Portugal includes an armillary sphere, a symbol of that nation's priority in developing the techniques of maritime navigation that won for the Portuguese history's first truly planetary empire. This English-language diagram of an armillary sphere shows that the horizontal ring represents the horizon. This provides a useful clue to what William James meant by saying that it is impossible to strip the human element out from even our most abstract theorizing. In a paper published in 1868 by the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, entitled Some Consequences of Four Incapacities, Peirce wrote that everything which is present to us is a phenomenal manifestation of ourselves. A simple example of what Peirce meant is a horizon. When we look at the ocean, we see a horizon, which is the line that separates the earth from the sky. The horizon is not a part of the ocean, but simply denotes the limit of that part of the earth's surface we can see from where we happen to be standing. The horizon, the ocean, and we ourselves are three members of a triadic relationship, which, as we saw at the beginning of this lecture, is the definition of a sign. As we also saw at the beginning of this lecture, the sign relationship is the only mode of being that is indifferent to the distinction between mind-dependent and mind-independent reality. A horizon is neither real nor imaginary, but instead occupies the terra incognita between being and non-being. The horizon is one of many singularities that can appear in visual fields. In this slide, we see the vanishing point that appears when we stand on railroad tracks and see them converging to a point in the far distance. The parallel tracks do not, of course, actually meet, but this vanishing point, like the horizon, is simply a phenomenal manifestation of our own position. In mathematics, the vanishing point helped motivate the development of projective geometry, an example of the non-Euclidean geometry that results from discarding Euclid's axiom that parallel lines never meet. Non-Euclidean geometry eventually led to the non-Newtonian relativity theory of Einstein, and some have argued that this development will eventually be followed by the acceptance of non-Aristotelian logic, which discards the law of excluded middle, that is, the principle that there can be no intermediate between contradictories. Discarding the idea that something must be either P or not P is related to the semiotic idea of a terra incognita between being and non-being. This would suggest that semiotics could be defined as non-Aristotelian logic. The prefix non in the terms non-Euclidean, non-Newtonian, and non-Aristotelian does not, of course, mean anti, but rather generalization of. According to Peirce, the general might be defined as that to which the principle of excluded middle does not apply. The most spectacular example of a visual singularity is the rainbow, a triadic relationship between the sun, the rain, and ourselves. It is perhaps the most venerable example of a sign in ancient literature, appearing in the Bible, the Iliad, and in the Eddas of Nordic mythology. Peirce himself used the example of the rainbow in the sentence that follows his assertion that everything which is present to us is a phenomenal manifestation of ourselves. Another early theorist of semiotics, who used the example of the rainbow, was Mary Everest Boole. She was the widow of George Boole, who invented the Boolean algebra that is the foundation upon which the digital world in which we all now live is based. Mary Everest Boole knew very well that her question, "Rainbows, are they real or imaginary?" is unanswerable. Like all signs, rainbows are neither real nor imaginary, but have their own mode of being that Peirce called thirdness. She also knew, however, that singularities are found not only in visual fields, but in every human perception and conception, even in mathematics. This illustrates Peirce's contention that his rule that all perception and thought is through signs is proved by the existence of error and ignorance. To illustrate this, Boole invites her readers to perform a simple exercise using a compass, which I shall now simulate digitally. She begins by asking her readers to draw a circle 2 inches in diameter. She then asks her readers to draw 2 smaller circles that are a ½ inch in diameter, each centered upon the circumference of the larger circle. She then asks her readers to repeat this process for as long as patience and eyesight allow. We have just defined a law that describes a family of circles. Peirce called this process generalization. But something strange has happened. In addition to the continuum of green circles centered on the circumference of the large circle, we find that we have unintentionally drawn 2 more circles that also satisfy our law perfectly well, but are not part of the continuum. They're off by themselves, centered not on the circumference of the larger circle, but concentric with it. Mary Everest Boole observes that when singular solutions like this are discovered, they are usually treated as unwanted guests. They are exactly what software developers call bugs. Those with semiotic consciousness, however, recognize that all perceptions and conceptions contain singularities. The Chicago philanthropist Ethel Sturgis Dummer was a patron of both the Hull House settlement and the University of Chicago Sociology Department, the connections between which I have already discussed in this lecture. She was also a disciple of Mary Everest Boole. In 1930, she contacted Scott Buchanan, who had recently joined the philosophy faculty at the University of Virginia, and offered to finance a year's study in England, followed by a visit to the Warburg Library in Hamburg, if he would be willing to study Boole's thought. Dummer's interest in Buchanan had been sparked by his 1929 book Poetry and Mathematics, which, as he put it, treated poetry mathematically and mathematics poetically. In 1928, he wrote a review of Sidney Hook's book The Metaphysics of Pragmatism, which had been published the previous year by the Open Court Publishing Company in Chicago, once directed by Paul Karras. In this review, he captured the spirit of pragmatism with the phrase, "The world is my instrument," noting that when we recognize that what we have habitually considered to be things are in fact instruments, then subjective conditions are reabsorbed and reinterpreted as parts of nature and subject to its laws. Borrowing a phrase from Alfred North Whitehead, Buchanan states that the bifurcation of nature is thus healed. Buchanan had become good friends with Whitehead at Harvard, and in October 1931, he argued convincingly in a paper titled The Reification of Projective Geometry that Whitehead's cosmology is an answer to the question of what the world would be like if projective geometry were true. No object more strikingly illustrates Buchanan's phrase, "The world is my instrument," than the armillary sphere, which, as already discussed in this lecture, appears on the flag of the Republic of Portugal. By incorporating the subjective nature of the horizon, the zodiac, the Tropic of Cancer, and the Tropic of Capricorn into scientific instruments, Portugal won for itself the world's first planetary empire. This could be interpreted as history's first use of the principle of relativity. Centuries later, the United States won its own planetary empire by applying Einstein's theory of relativity to develop nuclear weapons. This parallel between post-medieval Portugal and the postmodern United States of America is even more striking when we notice in this slide the strong resemblance in shape between an armillary sphere and a plutonium core. Plutonium was isolated and measured for the first time in August and September of 1942. These events, which took place in the George Herbert Jones Laboratory on the campus of the University of Chicago, changed the world forever by making possible both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Elsewhere on the campus of the University of Chicago, just a short distance up the same street from Jones Laboratory, stood Chicago Pile 1, history's first man-made nuclear reactor. Here, in December of 1942, man achieved the first self-sustaining chain reaction, and thereby initiated the controlled release of nuclear energy. Although these events at the University of Chicago during 1942 took place under the strictest wartime secrecy, the university's president, Robert Maynard Hutchins, was a national celebrity thanks to the patronage of the powerful media baron Henry Luce. Formerly the dean of Yale's Law School, Hutchins had been appointed as Chicago's president in 1929, at the very young age of 30. His educational philosophy was what is currently known as educational perennialism. He sought to create a university that was devoted to the life of the mind, rather than to current events or vocational training, and believed that only metaphysics could provide the basis for such an education. His most important ally was Mortimer Adler, who had been introduced to St. Thomas Aquinas at Columbia University by Richard McKeon, a specialist in Aristotle and medieval philosophy. Hutchins and Adler's interests also extended to the education of the American public at large. Their most enduring legacy in this respect was the great books of the Western world. It is now out of print, but copies of the 54-volume set may be found today in nearly every library and used bookstore in the United States. Unfortunately, Hutchins is also famous for the so-called Chicago Fight, during which he earned the enmity of some of the most famous members of Chicago's faculty over his efforts to appoint Adler, McKeon, Jacques Maritain, and Scott Buchanan, the last of whom I have already mentioned in connection with Mary Everest Boole. The famous pragmatist philosophy department at the University of Chicago, that William James had so admired, was adamantly opposed to the neo-Thomist metaphysics championed by Adler and Maritain, and most of them, including the venerable George Herbert Mead, resigned in protest. Hutchins and Adler would probably have never even met, however, if it had not been for C.K. Ogden, a fellow of Magdalen College at Cambridge University. While still a young man, Ogden had struck up a correspondence with Lady Victoria Welby, an important pioneer of semiotics. On May 2, 1911, Welby wrote a letter to Charles Sanders Peirce that mentioned Ogden to Peirce as a potential disciple. Ogden devoted to Peirce an appendix of his seminal book The Meaning of Meaning, which he co-authored with the famous literary critic I.A. Richards in 1923. However, Ogden in his maturity ended up becoming a disciple of Jeremy Bentham, who is remembered today for his work in political philosophy, social reform, and jurisprudence, but his equally seminal work in semiotics has been unjustifiably neglected. Further evidence of the affinity of the Portuguese mind with semiotics is the fact that of all the nations that Bentham approached with an offer to codify their law according to his principles, Portugal's government, resulting from the liberal revolution of 1820, was the only one to accept. To return to our story, however, Ogden met Adler at Columbia University in 1926 and agreed to publish Adler's first book, titled Dialectic, together with the first book of Adler's friend Scott Buchanan, titled Possibility, as volumes in the series Ogden edited called the International Library of Psychology, Philosophy, and Scientific Method. Ogden had the proof sheets of Adler's book in hand when he visited Hutchins at Yale University the following year. Upon learning that Hutchins was doing work on the relationship between psychology and the law of evidence, Ogden showed Hutchins a footnote in Adler's book dedicated to that topic, and offered to introduce Adler to Hutchins. Hutchins accepted Ogden's offer, and so the partnership between Hutchins and Adler was born. However, the partnership between Hutchins and Adler was not the only seminal event in the history of semiotics to have been set in motion by C.K. Ogden. While still a teenager, Thomas Sebeok briefly attended Magdalen College at Cambridge University and encountered Ogden's International Library of Psychology, Philosophy, and Scientific Method. The books in Ogden's series set Sebeok on the path that would eventually lead him to establish academic semiotics in the form it takes today. In addition to Ogden's own foundational book, The Meaning of Meaning, co-authored with I.A. Richards, Sebeok first encountered in Ogden's series the writings of Charles Sanders Peirce and those of Jakob von Uexküll, the German biologist from Estonia, whose concept of Umwelt allowed Sebeok to extend semiotics into the natural sciences, thereby founding the discipline of biosemiotics. By 1939, Sebeok was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, and attended there the world's first seminars on semiotics, led by Professor Charles Morris. Morris had joined Chicago's philosophy department in 1931, shortly after the exodus of its pragmatist old guard, after years of protesting Hutchins' efforts to reform the department along Aristotelian and Neo-Thomist lines. Morris himself, however, was a figure very much in the pragmatist mold, and helped bring to Chicago causes that were anathema to the Hutchins camp, such as the logical positivism of the Vienna Circle, represented on Chicago's faculty by Rudolf Carnap, and the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science, spearheaded by Neurath. Morris also worked to bring the Bauhaus to Chicago, where it still exists today as the Design Institute at the Illinois Institute of Technology. In 2021, the Design Institute became North America's only affiliate of the new European Bauhaus Initiative. The philosophical differences between Hutchins and Morris were also tainted with personal animus, because Morris had won his position on the philosophy faculty at the expense of Adler's, a mutiny which forced Hutchins to transfer Adler to the university's law school. Sebeok himself became a casualty of the Chicago fight, after Richard McKeon, the man who had introduced Adler to St. Thomas Aquinas, expelled Sebeok from the linguistics department, a move which forced Sebeok to take his undergraduate degree in anthropology instead. Sebeok later wrote that the hostility of Hutchins toward Morris set back the nascent rise of semiotics in the United States by easily a quarter of a century. We may wonder whether Sebeok had noticed, while at Cambridge, that Ogden's series included not only works by Peirce and Uexküll, but also works by Adler and Buchanan. In other words, the two sides of the Chicago fight, for all their enmity, had the same philosophical roots. The ultimate reason for this similarity may have been discovered by John Deely, who traced both the post-medieval Thomist definition of sign and the postmodern Chicago definition of sign back to the commentaries on Aristotle by the Jesuit College of Coimbra. The pair of books by Adler and Buchanan, which Ogden published simultaneously in 1927, greatly influenced John Deely's career. The common theme of these two books, each of which referred to the other, was the Summa Dialectica. As Adler described this project more than 60 years later, the Summa Dialectica would produce for the pluralistic 20th century what the Summa Theologica did for Christendom in the 13th. Unlike the medieval Summa, which proceeded from the articles of Christian faith dogmatically declared, the Summa Dialectica would call for suspended judgment about truth and falsity. It would present all points of view without taking any point of view. This reflects the semiotic principle of indifference to the distinction between mind-dependent and mind-independent reality, I've noted already in this lecture. Adler eventually left the University of Chicago in 1952 to found the Institute for Philosophical Research, to be advised by Jacques Maritain. The purpose of this organization was to compile the Summa Dialectica, which Adler and Buchanan had first proposed a quarter of a century earlier. John Deely's first major career accomplishment was his close association with Adler at the Institute for Philosophical Research from 1969 to 1974, during which Deely did his first work on Maritain's hero John of St. Thomas, whom Deely preferred to call John Poinsot. In 1955, the University of Chicago published the first English-language translation of selections from Jean Poinsot's Cursus Philosophicus Domesticus, and included a preface by Jacques Maritain. These selections were concerned with Poinsot's material logic, and selections concerned with his formal logic were published in English translation by Marquette University during the same year. Marquette University is, of course, named for the Jesuit explorer Jacques Marquette, whom I have mentioned earlier in this lecture. The portrait of Maritain included on this slide was drawn by Maud Hutchins, the wife of Robert Maynard Hutchins. On a previous slide, we saw that Buchanan wrote in his book published by C.K. Ogden that the Summa Dialectica would be comparable to the ideal of international law and the League of Nations, and like them, is a utopia taken from Plato's Republic. More than 20 years after this was published, Hutchins delivered the Aquinas lecture for 1949 under the auspices of the Aristotelian Society of Marquette University, which was later published by that university's press. Its title was St. Thomas and the World State. The collaboration between Hutchins, Adler, and Maritain cannot be fully understood apart from its connections with the movement for world federalism. Like the Jesuits of Coimbra, who found themselves faced with the task of educating history's first planetary empire, Hutchins and his allies retreated upon Aristotle to create a curriculum capable of supporting the burden of planetary empire that had fallen to the United States of America with the outcome of World War II. In 1948, the University of Chicago published a text bearing the title Preliminary Draft of a World Constitution that was signed by a committee of 11 figures that included Hutchins and Adler. Significantly, only one of the 11 signers was employed by a university outside of the United States. He was the economic historian Harold Innis of the University of Toronto, who earned his PhD at the University of Chicago. Innis's first major work appeared in 1930 under the title The Fur Trade in Canada, a treatise on the economy of New France, and which relied heavily on the Jesuit relations for its primary source material. In 1950, he published his seminal work Empire and Communications, which greatly influenced the Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan. As we saw in an earlier slide, it is a principle of semiotics that there is only one world, and there can be no worlds unto themselves. Maritain and his allies, such as John Neff, a co-founder of the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, argued that global government is possible because universally valid moral judgments are possible, a theory known as natural law. But another co-founder of this committee, the University of Chicago economist Frank Knight, saw natural law arguments as simply a veiled justification for papal supremacy. The actual major premise of the scholastic philosophy of Hutchins and his allies, Knight argued in 1949, is and must be, now as in the Dark Ages, the dogma that there is a human authority above the political procedures that make positive law and the social processes that make custom and public opinion. Knight went on to name Catholicism as one of the three great current totalitarianisms, alongside communism and fascism. Knight's article proved that the argument between pragmatism and Catholicism had hardly progressed at all since the days of the Free Religious Association founded by Francis Ellingwood Abbott, a friend of Charles Sanders Peirce. Abbott, considered by Peirce to be one of the strongest minds Peirce had ever encountered, sought by organized political means to eliminate Catholicism from public life. Paul Carus's journal, The Open Court, which, as we have already seen, published many articles by Peirce, became the official house organ of the Free Religious Association in 1887. But if pragmatism is philosophically incompatible with Catholicism, as both sides of the dispute seem to agree, even well after World War II, then how was it possible for Dealey to argue that the main premise of pragmatism was derived from the Coimbra Jesuit College? An essay published in 1850 by Thomas Carlyle may give us a clue. The Jesuits did not invent lying, he wrote. Lying is as old as the Garden of Eden. Carlyle did accuse the Jesuits of raising lying to a science, and therefore considering it usable for the greater glory of God. From this perspective, Dealey's claim that semiotics was first raised to a science by the Coimbra Jesuits is supported by Umberto Eco, who wrote that semiotics is in principle the discipline studying everything which can be used in order to lie. Eco goes on to say that a theory of the lie should be taken as a pretty comprehensive program for a general semiotics. The examples of Knight, Abbott, and Carlyle, however, show that the word lie can trigger moralistic reactions that make true understanding difficult. So perhaps another way to describe semiotic consciousness is in order. Consider this song from William Shakespeare's play Cymbeline, first staged in 1611. This slide shows how it appears in the Great Books of the Western World edited by Robert Maynard Hutchins. Golden lads and girls all must as chimney sweepers come to dust. Hugh Kenner tells a story about this song in his classic work The Pound Era, published in 1971. He writes that, as language changes, something happens to old poems, the range of whose words changes. The many generations of readers and literary critics that have come and gone since 1611 have been stirred by the words golden lads and chimney sweepers. They have been considered a contrast of two immemorial symbols, at once Christian and pagan, the dust to which all sons of Adam return, the gold by which human vitality braves time. But one day during the mid-20th century, a visitor to Shakespeare's Warwickshire met a countryman who blew the grey head off a dandelion and said, "We call these golden boys chimney sweepers when they go to seed." The visitor to Shakespeare's Warwickshire had accidentally discovered what Shakespeare's expression had meant to Shakespeare himself. He was talking about dandelions. When golden dandelions go to seed, they take on the shape and color of the brooms used to sweep chimneys. Everybody in Warwickshire in the early 17th century would have known what Shakespeare was talking about, because that colorful local expression was part of their culture. But centuries later, the rural folklore of Shakespeare's time and place was all but extinct, and of course was never known at all by the audience far beyond rural England that Shakespeare's plays would eventually attract. Shakespeare's words remained the same, but it was his readers of the then very distant future who would provide them with their new meaning. The British author Vernon Lee, in her introduction to the English translation of a book by Richard Seemann, a German biologist and monist, whose theory of organic memory influenced C.K. Ogden and Bertrand Russell, shows that the story of Shakespeare's golden lads illustrates the fundamental principle of psychology. If mind were to reproduce the past perfectly, then it would not be mind. Only the words of the prayer book could describe the situation. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. To which might be added, perhaps not inappropriately, world without mind. As the final words of the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg's seminal book, The Legitimacy of the Modern Age, express it, history knows no return of the same. Renaissances are its contradiction. Vernon Lee adds that without this characteristic, we should all be like Bourbon, never forgetting and never learning. The partial return of the past is what accounts for the most elementary psychic happenings, the transformation of sensations into perceptions. To express this idea in Deely's language, the sign is what brings an object into awareness. This principle has long been understood by those who think semiotically. The University of Pittsburgh philosopher Oliver Reiser, who corresponded with Ethel Sturgis Dummer, wrote that the fallacy underlying research in what we may term cultural paleontology and the writing of history is the idea that the past is past. There is a very general belief that the past is irrevocable, that history cannot be changed. Now it is doubtless true that the past is past, but certainly this does not prove that the past is unalterable. To argue that this is so is to reason in materialistic rather than in organismic terms. In the cultural interpretation of human history, the past is what it is because of its influence on the present. And if we change the present, we have in a sense altered the past. There is here a real alchemy in events that is grounded in time's living progress. Reiser adds that history is the expression of an aspiration and a groping. No man or age fully realizes what it is about. Scott Buchanan, in the opening words of the book in which he introduced the world to the Summa Dialectica, wrote, "The life of man might be portrayed as a series of rebirths, each of which consists in a passage from one world into another. The state of affairs at any given instant is an unstable equilibrium between opposing forces and values. One lives in one world and believes in another, suffering this and at the same time expecting or desiring that." Carlyle considered the Jesuit discovery of a mode of being that is indifferent to the distinction between mind-dependent and mind-independent reality to be a general theory of lying, but a semiotician recognizes it as the discovery of thirdness, or a state of tension between one world and another. It was discovered by the Portuguese because their characteristic attitude is saudade, and their characteristic metaphysics is eschatological. The Iberian origin of both semiotics and the world's first two planetary empires may have had something to do with Saint Isidore of Seville, a doctor of the Church from the late 6th and early 7th centuries. His work Etymologies, an etymological dictionary of the Latin language, whose first 3 books are devoted to the 7 liberal arts, became the Summa Dialectica of medieval Europe, and earned Isidore not only dozens of citations in the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas, but also a place in Dante's Paradise. During the early 16th century, prophecies attributed to Isidore began to appear of an encubierto, the hidden one, who would restore the lost Golden Age. By the beginning of the 17th century, during the same years in which the final volumes of the commentaries on Aristotle by the Coimbra Jesuit College were being published, the encubierto prophecies were also being published for the first time in the form of Sebastianism, a messianic prophecy that the King of Portugal, who disappeared in 1578 during a battle in Morocco, will someday reappear to rule both Portugal and what will be called the Quinto Imperio, or Fifth Empire, foretold by the Book of Daniel. A generation later, the Jesuit priest António Vieira gave this prophecy its definitive literary form in his book The History of the Future. His title, which implies that history is not about the past but the future, is a stunning anticipation of the thesis we have been exploring in this lecture. Semiotics, as John Dee and many of his predecessors pointed out, is the study of how the future influences the past, just as postmodern Chicago influenced postmedieval Coimbra. Some have considered Sebastianism to be a variant of the Seven Sleepers legend, which appears not only in the Roman martyrology used in the Catholic liturgy, which assigns them a feast day on July 27th, but also in the Quran. Scott Buchanan once invoked the Seven Sleepers as the patrons of his project to restore the seven liberal arts, which he once called medieval orthology, in honor of C.K. Ogden, who called his own version of semiotics by that name. Buchanan compared the Seven Sleepers with the muses of the seven liberal arts, who sometimes sleep for centuries in a cave under Mount Helicon, to be awakened by a wandering shepherd boy playing his pipes. However, a long journey sometimes has to be made to reach Mount Helicon across centuries and continents. This lecture has also made a long journey across centuries and continents, and now must end. I hope that my tale of two cities, post-medieval Coimbra and postmodern Chicago, has helped to bring into focus not only the technical aspects of semiotic thinking, but also its beauties, joys, and perhaps even dangers. One aspect of semiotics I discussed in this lecture is monism. There can be only one world. Carl Jung called this unus mundus, and Peirce called it cynicism. Signs manifest themselves in Jung's oneness as synchronicity, and in Peirce's as surprises. Another aspect of semiotics is boundaries. Although there is only one world, we can never see it all from one place. Nietzsche wrote in 1872 that all knowledge originates from separation, delimitation, and restriction. There is no absolute knowledge of a whole. And Goethe once wrote, "Wilt thou into infinities wander, roam through the finite, hither and yonder." Just as we see a horizon when we look at the ocean, there are horizons in all our perceptions and conceptions. To be aware of these horizons is to be semiotically conscious. Semiotics is a philosophy of being, and there is no being without boundaries. The paradox of existence is that all things are trying to become the universal by excluding other things, as said in 1919 by the American author Charles Fort. The mode of being proper to the sign is neither being nor non-being, but an oscillatory mode between the two, that Peirce called thirdness. The British logician George Spencer Brown formulated this by adding to the traditional logical values of true and false a third value, imaginary, which he compared to the introduction of imaginary numbers, that is, numbers that include the square root of -1, into arithmetic. Semiotics can therefore be thought of as a non-Aristotelian logic, because it discards the law of excluded middle. Semiotics is about relations. Peirce's logic of relatives was among his most important achievements. Pragmatism, as Buchanan pointed out, is about seeing the world as our instrument. An atom, for instance, is not a thing but a relationship, just as a rainbow is a relationship between the sun, the rain, and ourselves. The principle of relativity that Einstein brought into physics is applicable to any field of human inquiry. Semiotics can be thought of as the principle of relativity brought into logic. This is why John Dee said that semiotics is the matrix of all the sciences. Semiotics is about the future. It implies an eschatological ontology in which the future, according to Peirce, is the primary reality. This is because semiotics abandons the law of excluded middle, and the future, as Aristotle said, is the only place where this law does not apply. The eschatological nature of semiotics is very well expressed by the Portuguese in the tradition of Sebastianism, which is, as Vieira said, a history of the future. A sign is the presence of an absence. Buchanan described this feeling as living in one world while believing in another. I propose this as an approximation of the Portuguese word saudade. And on that note, I conclude this lecture.
It's the best in the Midwest. It's a real down city full of good folks who come from home. When I get back, I'll never roam far from a little shy town. Goodbye, farewell, I might see you later. Going to Chicago, sorry but I can't take you. I come from Chi-Town.
Thank you, Kermit, for your presentation. We are now beginning sometime to ask you some questions, but I leave the coordination of this session of question and answer to another colleague that is here in the regie. So, Ikeda.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Kermit, for your presentation. Now, we would like to open this seminar for the question and answer session.